They never looked twice at the woman in the grease-stained coveralls. Her hands calloused from years of working on engines that most people would never understand. Her name was on a faded laminate badge clipped to her chest, just another maintenance mechanic rotating through Fort Ridgemont, one of the Army's most critical logistics hubs in the Mountain West. The base commander, Colonel Derek Harrington, had never bothered to learn her name. To him, she was invisible, part of the machinery that kept his command functioning, like the generators and transmission systems she repaired daily. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman adjusting hydraulic lines in the motor pool that freezing January morning had spent 7 years as one of the most elite operators the United States Navy had ever trained. She'd rappelled from helicopters into hostile territory. She'd led midnight raids across 3 continents. She'd made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for her teammates. And now, she was pretending that the most complicated thing in her world was fixing a broken fuel pump. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Her name was Captain Victoria Ashford, though at Fort Ridgemont she went by Vicky Patterson, maintenance specialist, contract worker, the kind of person who showed up, did the job, and faded into the background like she'd never been there at all. It was exactly how she wanted it. The transformation had taken months to arrange. The false credentials, the fabricated employment history, the carefully constructed identity that would pass any casual inspection. Naval intelligence had orchestrated every detail, working with Pentagon liaisons to create senior maintenance mechanic Vicky Patterson, a veteran technician rotating in from a private contracting firm, experienced with military vehicle systems, reliable and forgettable. The kind of worker who made bases function while remaining invisible to senior command. Victoria had played similar roles before in different contexts. Intelligence gathering in foreign ports. Assessment operations embedded within allied military units. The delicate art of becoming someone else entirely while remaining true to your core mission. But this assignment was different. This one had personal weight. 6 months ago, one of her former SEAL teammates had called her with devastating news. Lieutenant Commander James Hartley, one of the brightest operators she'd ever trained with, had taken his own life. The official report called it a struggle with depression. The Army investigated, filed their paperwork, documented their findings. All proper procedures followed. But when James's wife, Rachel, had called Victoria in tears, the story had been devastatingly different. She'd spoken about impossible demands from base leadership, public humiliation during training exercises, a systematic pattern of undermining his confidence and authority, about a man who'd gone from confident warrior to anxious, second-guessing shadow in the space of 3 weeks under a new commander's leadership. He kept saying he wasn't good enough, Rachel had whispered through her tears. He was failing his team, failing the mission, failing everything. But James was never a failure, Captain. Never. Victoria had requested this assignment that very day. Fort Ridgemont was home to the 847th Combat Support Battalion, a critical unit responsible for logistics, vehicle maintenance, and equipment readiness across the entire Northern Command region. For the past 18 months, the base's efficiency ratings had been plummeting. Personnel transfer requests had skyrocketed. Experienced NCOs were leaving the Army entirely rather than complete their tours. Equipment failures that should have been caught during routine maintenance were making it into the field. And at the center of it all was Colonel Derek Harrington, a 31-year veteran with a reputation that preceded him like a storm front. Harrington commanded through intimidation. His voice cut across the motor pool like a blade through silk, demanding answers about incompetence and laziness from soldiers who were simply following his own contradictory directives. He made decisions about critical equipment without understanding the technical realities those decisions affected. He dismissed safety concerns as overcautious whining. He transferred officers who questioned his judgment and blamed enlisted personnel for problems created by his own mismanagement. In 3 weeks at Fort Ridgemont, Victoria had documented everything. The maintenance protocols that hadn't been updated in 5 years. The vehicle safety inspections that were being signed off without being performed. The supply requisitions sitting on Harrington's desk for months while critical parts remained unavailable. the junior officers who'd tried to raise concerns and been shouted into submission. She'd moved through the motor pool like a ghost, clipboard in hand, her Navy SEAL training making her invisible when she needed to be, unremarkable when attention threatened to find her. Her accommodations were in a shared barracks with other contract workers, mechanics and technicians rotating through Fort Ridgemont. Men and women who talked about families back home and complained about assignment rotations. They treated her like any other coworker, included her in conversations about base politics, shared coffee from the common room, warned her about which officers to avoid and which ones actually knew their jobs. Through them, Victoria learned that Colonel Harrington's reputation extended far beyond his official duties. Stories about junior officers transferred for asking questions, about maintenance schedules revised weekly based on his moods, about safety protocols ignored when they interfered with his timeline demands. "Guy's been here 3 years," Sergeant James Wu, a vehicle technician, had told her over breakfast. "Turned this place into his personal kingdom. Acts like he owns the entire Northern Command. Nothing gets done without his approval, and half the time he doesn't understand what he's approving." Victoria had nodded, made sympathetic noises, asked the right follow-up questions, all while taking mental notes that would become part of her official assessment. All while understanding that James Hartley's death wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the predictable outcome of a system that had allowed toxic leadership to metastasize for 3 years without institutional intervention. Today, that was about to change. She'd received her official orders that morning, encrypted in a secure message that self-deleted after reading. Assume immediate covert command authority at Fort Ridgemont. Conduct full operational assessment of leadership failures. Prepare for immediate intervention if safety protocols continued to be compromised. The kind of assignment they gave you when someone in Washington had finally had enough. Someone who understood that preventing the next James Hartley mattered more than protecting the reputation of a senior officer who'd risen beyond his competence. Victoria pulled her work gloves on tighter and returned to the vehicle she'd been servicing, her mind already calculating the endgame. She had 1 week to observe. 1 week to document, 1 week to gather irrefutable evidence. And then, Colonel Derek Harrington was going to meet the woman he'd been ignoring all along. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning when the temperature had dropped below freezing and the entire motor pool was operating on a schedule that would have been aggressive even under ideal circumstances. Victoria was beneath a Humvee, checking the transmission fluid levels, when she heard Colonel Harrington's voice cut through the facility like a whip crack. She didn't need to see him to know what was happening. 7 years of military training had taught her to read situations through sound alone. The cadence of his footsteps, the aggressive pitch of his voice, the way personnel scattered like startled birds when he entered a space. "Where the hell is the maintenance report on the M939 convoy trucks?" Harrington's voice echoed across the metal ceiling of the motor pool. "These vehicles are supposed to deploy to forward operations in 72 hours. And I want confirmation that every single one is combat ready. Now." Victoria slid out from beneath the Humvee and positioned herself where she could observe without being observed. It was a skill that had served her well throughout her Navy SEAL career, being present but invisible, watching the leadership dynamics unfold without drawing attention to herself. What she saw confirmed everything she'd documented over the past week. Master Sergeant Thomas Reeves, one of the most experienced vehicle maintenance supervisors on the base, stood at attention, his jaw tight with barely contained frustration. Reeves had been with the Army for 23 years. He understood vehicle systems the way most people understood their own bodies, instinctively, comprehensively, with the kind of expertise that should have been invaluable to any commanding officer. Instead, he was being treated like an incompetent subordinate by a man who'd never spent a day working under a vehicle in his life. "Colonel, sir, we've identified critical issues with the brake systems on 4 of the M939s. Reeves began, his voice carefully controlled. "The hydraulic lines show signs of age-related deterioration. We're recommending a complete replacement before deployment rather than—" "I don't care about your recommendations, Sergeant," Harrington interrupted, his voice rising. "I care about timeline compliance. Those trucks deploy in 3 days. Every other base in Northern Command has managed to get their vehicles ready on schedule. Are you telling me that Fort Ridgemont can't do what every other command can accomplish? Sir, with respect, those other bases. With respect, Sergeant, I didn't ask for excuses. I asked for results. Harrington stepped closer, using his 6'2" frame to intimidate. The M939 fleet will be combat ready by Friday, or I want to know whose negligence is responsible for the delay. Is that understood? Yes, sir, Reeves replied, but Victoria could see the exhaustion in his posture. The subtle slump of shoulders that came from years of being blamed for failures created by the person doing the blaming. Around the motor pool, other technicians had stopped working, moving with the careful precision of people trying not to attract attention. They'd learned, over 3 years of Harrington's command, that invisibility was survival. The moment you drew his notice was the moment you became responsible for whatever problem happened to be frustrating him at that particular second. Victoria watched as Harrington continued his tirade, moving from one station to another, finding fault with everything despite the quality of work being performed. A soldier had organized tool racks in the wrong sequence. Another had filed a maintenance log incorrectly. A third had the audacity to suggest that a particular vehicle system required additional diagnostic time before clearing it for deployment. Each perceived infraction was met with public criticism designed to humiliate rather than educate. What struck Victoria most was how systematically the dysfunction operated. This wasn't the result of a single bad decision or an isolated incident. This was the accumulated effect of 3 years of leadership that prioritized appearance over substance, deadline compliance over safety, and the commanding officer's ego over the actual welfare of personnel and equipment. The vehicles Harrington was demanding be deployed represented millions of dollars in military assets and, more critically, represented the lives of soldiers who would depend on their reliability in combat situations. After Harrington stormed out of the motor pool, leaving a wake of demoralized personnel in his path, Victoria made her way to where Reeves was standing, staring at the maintenance logs with the expression of someone who'd been fighting an impossible battle for far too long. "Master Sergeant Reeves," Victoria said quietly, keeping her voice low and her demeanor unremarkable. "Those M939 hydraulic lines, how critical are they really?" Reeves glanced at her, seeming to register her for the first time as something more than background noise. "Mission critical. If those lines fail under combat conditions, the entire convoy loses braking capability. You're looking at potential loss of life." "But the colonel doesn't understand vehicle systems well enough to know what he doesn't know," Reeves finished bitterly. "He sees delays as failures of my department. He sees safety concerns as excuses. And he sees anyone who disagrees with him as insubordinate." Reeves shook his head. "We've tried going through proper channels. I filed maintenance reports. Lieutenant Patterson has submitted technical assessments. 3 of our best technicians have already transferred out rather than continue working under these conditions." Victoria filed that information away, added it to the growing catalog of evidence documenting systematic leadership failure. But what she heard in Reeves's voice wasn't just frustration. It was something more dangerous, the resignation of someone who'd stopped believing that the system would ever correct itself. "What if someone could fix this?" Victoria asked carefully. "What if someone with actual authority arrived and addressed the problems?" Reeves looked at her with something approaching pity. "With respect, ma'am, that's not how the Army works. Harrington has connections at Northern Command headquarters. His efficiency reports are always positive because he controls who writes them. The only way this changes is if someone in Washington finally notices what's happening here. And by then, more people will have transferred. More careers will be damaged. More good soldiers will question whether the Army is worth their service." He walked away before Victoria could respond, leaving her alone with the M939 convoy trucks that represented the central crisis of Fort Ridgemont. Vehicles that needed to be combat-ready in 72 hours. Vehicles with critical safety issues that Harrington was demanding be ignored. Vehicles that would carry soldiers into potentially lethal situations with compromised equipment because a commanding officer had chosen timeline compliance over their safety. Victoria understood in that moment that passive observation had become dangerous negligence. The window for covert assessment was closing. The situation was escalating toward a breaking point that could result in real casualties. She had 3 days before those trucks deployed. 3 days to document the final evidence she needed. 3 days before she would need to reveal herself and intervene with the full authority of her position. The real work was about to begin. The 72-hour countdown began at 0600 hours on Wednesday morning, and Victoria shifted into a mode of operation that drew on every skill she'd developed during her 7 years as a Navy SEAL. Covert intelligence gathering wasn't about dramatic moments or flashy revelations. It was about meticulous documentation, pattern recognition, and the ability to see what others missed because they weren't looking for it. She'd spent the previous week in the motor pool establishing herself as a reliable, forgettable presence. Now she needed to deepen that invisibility while simultaneously gathering the specific evidence that would justify immediate intervention. The first stop on her intelligence-gathering rounds was the Maintenance Records Storage Facility, a climate-controlled room buried in the basement of the Fort Ridgemont administrative building. The facility was ostensibly restricted to authorized personnel, but Victoria had learned long ago that most security systems were designed to keep out people trying to enter from outside. Someone already inside the compound, moving with purposeful confidence like they belonged there, rarely drew a second glance. She accessed the room at 0430 hours, before the administrative staff arrived, using credentials that identified her as a routine maintenance contractor conducting equipment inventory. The records told a story that transcended any single maintenance report or individual failure. Going back 18 months, Victoria traced a pattern that was almost mathematical in its progression. Maintenance schedules that had been consistently met under the previous commander, Colonel Patricia Winters, had begun slipping immediately after Harrington took over. Vehicle inspection cycles that were supposed to occur every 30 days had been extended to 60 days, then 90 days. Critical safety evaluations that required specialized equipment had been signed off as completed on dates when that equipment wasn't even available at the facility. More troubling was the documentation of what Victoria recognized as systematic falsification. Inspection reports marked as comprehensive that contained only cursory notes. Safety clearances signed by personnel who, according to duty rosters, weren't even present at the facility on the dates they supposedly completed the inspections. Maintenance protocols marked as current that were actually 3 years out of date. It wasn't the work of incompetent personnel. It was the work of people forced to choose between their professional standards and their careers, forced to sign off on incomplete work because refusing to do so meant transfer, demotion, or public humiliation. Victoria photographed every document with the miniature camera concealed in her maintenance badge. The images would become part of the formal record that would eventually support command intervention. She paid particular attention to the M939 convoy maintenance logs, tracing the historical pattern of vehicle condition reports going back 2 years. The hydraulic system failures that Reeves had flagged weren't sudden problems. They were predictable deterioration that should have been caught and addressed during routine maintenance cycles. Under Colonel Winters's command, they would have been. Under Harrington's command, they'd been systematically ignored. By Thursday morning, Victoria had expanded her investigation to personnel records. She conducted her interviews carefully, positioning herself as a casual conversation partner rather than an interrogator. She shared coffee with technicians and mechanics during their breaks. She commiserated with engineers about the frustrations of working under unrealistic deadlines. She listened to the stories that emerged when people finally found someone who seemed genuinely interested in their perspectives rather than their compliance. The pattern became devastatingly clear. Sergeant William Patterson, no relation to her cover identity, had filed 4 separate safety concerns in the past 6 months. Each had been dismissed as overcautious. When he'd persisted, he'd been reassigned to a position that wasted his expertise in vehicle diagnostics. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun had submitted detailed technical assessments about equipment readiness that contradicted the colonel's optimistic public statements. Her efficiency report, filed by Harrington personally, had noted difficulty accepting direction and reluctance to prioritize mission over technical minutiae. What struck Victoria most was the consistency of the retaliation. Anyone who raised legitimate safety concerns faced career consequences. Anyone who disagreed with Harrington's timeline demands was transferred or documented as insubordinate. Anyone with technical expertise that threatened his authority was systematically marginalized. 3 experienced NCOs had already left the Army rather than continue serving under his command. 2 promising young officers had requested transfers. 1 enlisted specialist had attempted suicide, a fact mentioned casually by a colleague as personal issues, but documented in the personnel files as occurring 2 weeks after a public dressing down by Harrington. Thursday afternoon brought the crisis point Victoria had anticipated but hoped to avoid. She was conducting routine maintenance on one of the M939 convoy trucks when Reeves found her with urgent news. Colonel Harrington had just ordered an accelerated deployment timeline. The trucks that were supposed to leave on Saturday would now depart Friday morning, 48 hours earlier than the original schedule. He received a call from Northern Command, Reeves explained, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Some VIP delegation is visiting the Forward Operations Theater, and Harrington wants our convoy there to demonstrate base readiness. He's ordered all vehicles declared combat ready by 1800 hours Friday, or he's personally investigating the chain of command for negligence. Victoria's pulse quickened, but her expression remained calm. 48 hours. That was how much time they had before vehicles with compromised safety systems would be deployed carrying soldiers into potentially lethal situations. Master Sergeant, are the hydraulic systems on those 4 M939s combat ready? She asked quietly. Reeves's jaw tightened. No, they need at least another week for proper replacement and testing. But Harrington doesn't care about proper procedure. He cares about looking good for Northern Command. Then we need to make sure he understands the actual situation, Victoria said carefully. We've tried that, Reeves replied bitterly. He doesn't listen to technical concerns. He only listens to authority above his own rank. Victoria excused herself and made her way to the secure communications facility, where she spent 30 minutes transmitting encrypted messages to her Pentagon contact. The documentation she'd gathered was damning: systematic falsification of maintenance records, willful ignoring of safety violations, deliberate retaliation against personnel who raised legitimate concerns, and now, deliberate acceleration of vehicle deployment beyond safe parameters. It was exactly the kind of evidence that justified immediate intervention. By Friday morning, the response had come through. Her operational authority had been expanded. She no longer needed to gather evidence. She now had authorization to assume full command authority at Fort Ridgemont, relieve Colonel Harrington of operational control, and implement immediate safety assessments. The Pentagon had determined that imminent threat to personnel and equipment justified extraordinary measures. Friday at 0800 hours, Colonel Harrington held an all-hands meeting to celebrate the successful completion of the M939 convoy preparations. He stood before the assembled personnel with the confidence of a man who'd never been truly challenged by someone with comparable authority. He spoke about deadline compliance and mission readiness, about the importance of pushing through technical obstacles to accomplish strategic objectives. Victoria stood at the back of the formation, still in her grease-stained coveralls, still invisible as far as Harrington was concerned. But in her pocket was the official paperwork that would change everything. The documentation of systematic failures, the evidence of falsified records, the proof of retaliation against personnel who'd raised legitimate safety concerns. Harrington was mid-sentence when he finally noticed her moving through the crowd toward the front of the formation. He paused, irritation flickering across his face at being interrupted. Colonel Harrington, Victoria said, her voice cutting through the assembly like a blade. We need to discuss the actual status of those M939 vehicles. And we need to do it now. Harrington's expression shifted from irritation to confusion. Ma'am, I don't believe we've been introduced. If you have concerns about vehicle readiness, you should be bringing them to Master Sergeant Reeves through proper channels. I'm aware of proper channels, Victoria replied. I'm also aware that proper channels have been systematically ignored at this facility for the past 3 years. And I have documentation to prove it. The assembly had gone silent. Personnel who'd spent 3 years living under Harrington's command seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. something that might finally address the dysfunction they'd all been forced to navigate. "Ma'am, I don't know who you think you are," Harrington began. "Captain Victoria Ashford, United States Navy," she said calmly. "And as of 0800 hours this morning, I'm the commanding officer of Fort Ridgemont, operating under direct Pentagon authority. Those M939 vehicles are not deploying anywhere until they meet full safety specifications. And Colonel Harrington, you're relieved of operational command, effective immediately." Captain Victoria Ashford remained in the motor pool after the assembly dispersed, watching as the shock rippled through the personnel who'd spent 3 years under Colonel Harrington's command. Some looked confused, others appeared relieved, but none seemed surprised. They'd been living with the dysfunction long enough to recognize that something fundamental had shifted in the power dynamics of their facility. Master Sergeant Reeves approached her cautiously, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious questions forming behind his eyes. "Captain, I need to understand what just happened here. You arrived at this facility 7 days ago as a maintenance contractor. Now you're telling me you're the commanding officer of Fort Ridgemont." "Not telling you, Master Sergeant," Victoria replied, pulling the official documentation from her pocket and handing it to him. "Showing you. The Pentagon has authorized immediate command intervention based on systematic leadership failures. I've been here conducting covert assessment of those failures. Now I'm authorized to act on what I've documented." Reeves examined the orders, his eyes scanning the Pentagon letterhead and authorization signatures. "This is classified at the highest levels," he said quietly. "You've been investigating the colonel this entire time?" "I've been documenting what you and your team have already known for 3 years," Victoria replied. "The systematic falsification of maintenance records, the retaliation against personnel who raise safety concerns, the deliberate acceleration of vehicle deployment schedules that compromise safety. Colonel Harrington didn't create those problems in isolation. He created them because no one with the authority to stop him has been willing to do so." Reeves handed the documents back, understanding beginning to crystallize in his weathered features. "What happens to him now?" "That depends on several factors," Victoria said. "The Pentagon will conduct a formal investigation. He'll face potential court-martial for falsification of records and willful endangerment of personnel. But first, we need to address the immediate crisis. Those M939 vehicles cannot deploy tomorrow under any circumstances." "He won't accept that," another voice said. Victoria turned to see Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun approaching, her uniform bearing the insignia of the motor pool's operations officer. "Colonel Harrington has spent the past 6 months building a narrative about our incompetence. If those vehicles don't deploy, he'll claim it's because of failures in my department. That narrative ends today," Victoria said calmly. "Lieutenant Commander Chun, you're now the acting operations officer for vehicle readiness. I want a complete assessment of every vehicle scheduled for deployment. Not the paperwork version, the actual technical reality. Every system that's been signed off without proper inspection. Every safety concern that's been dismissed. Every vehicle that doesn't meet combat-ready specifications. I want brutal honesty about our actual operational status." "Yes, ma'am," Chun replied, and Victoria could see the relief in her posture. For 6 months, Chun had been fighting a battle against a commanding officer who didn't understand, or didn't care to understand, the technical realities she was reporting. Now, finally, someone with actual authority was asking her to do exactly what she'd been trained to do. The afternoon that followed was orchestrated chaos. Victoria established a temporary command center in the administrative building, converting a conference room into an operations hub where she could coordinate the vehicle assessment alongside the broader institutional reforms she needed to implement. But before she could focus on systemic change, she needed to understand the personal dimension of what had occurred at Fort Ridgemont over the past 3 years. She requested personnel files on the soldiers who'd transferred out, the officers who'd requested reassignment, and particularly the enlisted specialist who'd attempted suicide. The files told stories that transcended bureaucratic documentation. They were accounts of careers interrupted, promising futures derailed, and good people damaged by leadership that had confused authority with competence. One file in particular drew her attention. Lieutenant Commander James Hartley's service record showed exactly what Rachel Hartley had described. An exemplary officer whose performance reviews had shifted dramatically after being assigned to Harrington's command. From exceeds expectations and displays exceptional judgment to difficulty accepting direction and reluctance to prioritize mission readiness within a span of 3 weeks. The timeline aligned precisely with reports of increased public criticism and systematic undermining of his authority by the commanding officer. Victoria set the file down, feeling the personal weight of institutional failure settling on her shoulders. She'd come to Fort Ridgemont because of James Hartley's death. Because Rachel Hartley's words had made it clear that the official investigation had missed the human reality of toxic leadership. Now, looking at the evidence, she understood that Harrington's command had created an environment where capable, dedicated officers felt compelled to question their own competence despite objective evidence of their excellence. That was perhaps the most insidious aspect of toxic leadership, not the dramatic moments of public humiliation, but the subtle, cumulative erosion of confidence that left good people believing they were inadequate. It was a form of psychological warfare that operated within the system, protected by hierarchy and institutional loyalty. By Friday evening, Victoria had compiled enough evidence to formally charge Colonel Harrington with multiple violations of military code. The documentation included falsified maintenance records, willful endangerment of personnel, systematic retaliation against officers and enlisted personnel who raised legitimate safety concerns, and deliberate acceleration of deployment schedules beyond safe parameters. More significantly, she'd gathered testimony from 37 personnel describing patterns of toxic leadership that had damaged careers and contributed to at least 3 documented cases of severe psychological distress. She scheduled a formal meeting with Harrington in her temporary command office, wanting to give him the opportunity to understand the scope of the investigation before the formal charges were filed. It was a courtesy she wasn't entirely sure he deserved, but Victoria had learned that institutional reform sometimes required demonstrating the values you were trying to instill: fairness, due process, respect for individual dignity even in the midst of accountability. Harrington arrived at the meeting with 2 senior officers from Northern Command who'd been hastily dispatched to assess the situation. He was still processing the shock of his relief from command, his face cycling through emotions ranging from indignation to something approaching denial. "Captain Ashford, I demand an explanation for this irregular command transfer," Harrington said as he entered the office. "The procedures you've followed violate every protocol established for command transitions. There should have been notification, proper ceremonies, official transition briefings. You can't simply appear at a facility and declare yourself in command based on allegations from disgruntled personnel." Victoria gestured for him to sit, maintaining the professional composure that had defined her military career. "Colonel Harrington, I'm not here to debate procedures. I'm here to inform you of the charges that will be formally filed against you pending investigation. The documentation I've gathered over the past 7 days establishes systematic violations of military code that endangered personnel and compromised equipment readiness." "This is outrageous," Harrington protested. "Those M939 vehicles are perfectly safe. The maintenance records are falsified," Victoria interrupted, her voice remaining calm despite the gravity of the accusation. "I have photographic documentation of inspection reports signed by personnel who weren't present at the facility on the dates they supposedly completed those inspections. I have maintenance logs indicating work was completed in timeframes that would be physically impossible. I have testimony from 37 personnel describing systematic retaliation against anyone who raised legitimate safety concerns." One of the Northern Command officers, a colonel named Morrison, leaned forward. "Captain Ashford, are you suggesting that the maintenance failures at this facility are the result of deliberate falsification rather than incompetence?" "I'm stating it as documented fact," Victoria replied. "Master Sergeant Reeves and his team are highly competent. The failures you're seeing are the direct result of compressed maintenance schedules, denied equipment requisitions, and systematic pressure to sign off on vehicles before they meet safety standards. When experienced personnel tried to report these concerns through proper channels, they faced career consequences. She opened the file containing personnel transfer requests, efficiency reports that contradicted objective performance, and documented instances of public criticism designed to humiliate rather than educate. Colonel Harrington has created a command climate where technical expertise is viewed as an obstacle rather than an asset, where raising safety concerns results in career damage, where vehicles are deemed combat-ready based on paperwork rather than actual system functionality. Harrington's face had gone pale. I was trying to meet Northern Command's expectations. The efficiency ratings, the deployment schedules, became more important than the safety of personnel and the integrity of equipment, Victoria said quietly. Colonel, your career has been defined by 31 years of service. But the past 3 years at Fort Ridgemont represent a fundamental failure of command responsibility. You actively created conditions where good people felt compelled to compromise their professional standards or face career consequences. The silence that followed was absolute. The Northern Command officers exchanged glances that suggested they understood the gravity of what they were hearing. This wasn't a personality conflict or a disagreement about procedures. This was systematic institutional failure created by a commanding officer who'd prioritized his own reputation over the welfare of personnel and equipment. What happens now? One of the officers asked. Now we begin the process of institutional reform, Victoria replied. Master Sergeant Reeves will assume interim command of vehicle operations. All M939 deployment is suspended pending completion of proper maintenance and safety assessment. I'm implementing immediate personnel reviews to identify and address the effects of retaliatory command practices. And Colonel Harrington will be transferred to Northern Command headquarters pending formal investigation. The crisis that had been building throughout Victoria's first week at Fort Ridgemont reached its critical breaking point at 0247 hours on Saturday morning when the emergency alarm system activated with a sound that turned sleeping soldiers into running figures within seconds. Victoria was already awake, had been for hours reviewing personnel files and strategic documentation in her temporary quarters, when the reactor-level alert echoed through the facility's communication system. But this wasn't a nuclear emergency. This was something equally catastrophic in its own way, a vehicle system failure that embodied everything she'd been fighting against since arriving at Fort Ridgemont. The M939 convoy truck designated as Lead Vehicle 1 had experienced complete hydraulic system failure during a routine pre-deployment diagnostic test. The test that Master Sergeant Reeves had insisted upon despite Colonel Harrington's pressure to skip additional inspections. The failure had occurred in the controlled environment of the motor pool rather than during actual combat deployment, which meant that lives had been saved by competence and caution rather than lost to deadline compliance and negligence. But the implications extended far beyond a single vehicle failure. The hydraulic system breakdown revealed exactly what Victoria had documented, the components showing signs of age-related deterioration that should have been replaced months ago. The maintenance logs that claimed inspections had been completed when they demonstrably had not. The falsified safety clearances that bore the signatures of personnel who'd been forced to choose between their professional integrity and their careers. Victoria reached the motor pool in 4 minutes, arriving at a scene of controlled emergency response. Floodlights blazed across the facility, turning night into harsh artificial day as technicians swarmed over the failed vehicle with the precision of people responding to a crisis they'd trained for extensively but hoped would never occur. Master Sergeant Reeves was already there, his face grim as he assessed the damage and coordinated the emergency response with the competence that had defined his 23 years of service. Captain, the hydraulic failure is catastrophic, Reeves reported, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. The primary system completely ruptured during diagnostic testing. Secondary systems engaged automatically, but if this had happened during actual deployment with full load, we'd be looking at loss of vehicle control and potential loss of personnel. Victoria's blood ran cold. This was exactly the scenario she'd warned about, the inevitable result of months of deferred maintenance and falsified inspections. The collision between reality and the narrative that Colonel Harrington had constructed about equipment readiness and personnel competence. How many other vehicles are showing similar deterioration? She asked, her voice remaining calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. At minimum, 3 more, Reeves replied. Possibly 5 if we're being thorough. Which is exactly what I was trying to tell the colonel before you relieved him of command. Lieutenant Commander Chun jogged up to their position, holding a tablet loaded with diagnostic data from the failed vehicle. Captain, I've been reviewing the maintenance records on this truck. The hydraulic system was supposed to receive a full inspection 6 months ago, according to the scheduled maintenance calendar. But the inspection was never completed. The work order exists. The inspection report exists. But the actual inspection never happened. Victoria accepted the tablet, scanning the documentation that confirmed what she'd already suspected. The paperwork trail created by a command structure that required documentation of work that hadn't been performed, inspection reports filed by personnel forced to falsify records, and safety clearances signed by people who were simply following orders from above rather than conducting honest assessments of equipment status. This is going to devastate the deployment schedule, Chun continued. Northern Command is expecting those vehicles to be in forward operations within 48 hours. If we're pulling 5 vehicles for complete hydraulic system replacement, we're looking at minimum 2 weeks before they can be safely deployed. Then that's exactly what's going to happen, Victoria said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. Those vehicles will not deploy anywhere until they meet full safety specifications. Not in 2 weeks, not in 4 weeks. Whatever timeline is necessary to do this job correctly. But even as she spoke those words, Victoria understood the political complications they created. She'd relieved a 31-year veteran colonel of command based on systematic leadership failures. She'd suspended vehicle deployment that had been promised to Northern Command. She'd essentially called into question the judgment of senior officers who'd accepted Harrington's efficiency reports at face value. The institutional resistance to her actions would intensify exponentially. By Saturday morning, that resistance had begun to manifest. Messages started arriving from Northern Command, initially requesting clarification about the deployment suspension, then escalating to demands for explanation. A formal investigation had been initiated into Victoria's assumption of command. Questions were being raised about the validity of her Pentagon authorization, the methodology of her covert assessment, and the appropriateness of her interference in a command that technically fell under Northern Command's authority rather than direct Pentagon supervision. Victoria responded to each inquiry with meticulously documented evidence. Photographs of falsified maintenance records. Personnel testimony describing systematic retaliation. Technical assessments confirming that the hydraulic system failure was entirely predictable based on deferred maintenance. But she also understood that documentation, while important, might not be sufficient to protect her from the institutional forces arrayed against her. Officers didn't take kindly to having their judgment questioned, particularly when that questioning came from a lower-ranking officer and particularly when it involved a colleague they'd presumably trusted. Saturday afternoon brought a message from the commanding general of Northern Command, a 3-star general named Patricia Hutchins, who'd earned her position through a reputation for intellectual rigor and institutional courage. The message requested Victoria's immediate presence at Northern Command headquarters for a formal briefing on the situation at Fort Ridgemont. It wasn't a request that could be refused, but it also represented the point at which Victoria's authority at Fort Ridgemont would be subject to external review. She spent Saturday evening preparing her presentation with the precision that had defined her military career. Every piece of evidence organized chronologically. Every personnel account documented with names and dates. Every technical assessment backed by independent verification. The goal wasn't to win a political argument. It was to present reality in such compelling form that institutional leadership would have to acknowledge what had occurred at Fort Ridgemont and commit to holding Colonel Harrington accountable. But Victoria also understood something deeper about this moment. The hydraulic system failure wasn't just a mechanical breakdown. It was validation of everything she'd been warning about. It was proof that the falsified maintenance records had real consequences. It was evidence that personnel who'd raised legitimate safety concerns had been right all along, and personnel who'd been forced to sign off on unsafe equipment had been operating under impossible conditions. Sunday morning, as she prepared to depart Fort Ridgemont for Northern Command headquarters, Victoria made a final inspection of the motor pool. Reeves was already there, directing a team of technicians in the systematic replacement of hydraulic systems on the vehicles that had been identified as priorities. The work was progressing with methodical competence, no longer constrained by artificial deadlines or pressure to cut corners. Personnel were performing their jobs with a level of focus and excellence that came from finally being allowed to do things correctly. Master Sergeant Reeves, you're in interim command while I'm at Northern Command, Victoria said. I want daily status reports on vehicle readiness. And Reeves, continue prioritizing safety above everything else. If Northern Command pushes back on timelines, reference the hydraulic failure as evidence that corner cutting creates worse problems than delays ever could. Yes, ma'am, Reeves replied. Captain, I need you to know something. You walking into this facility and treating our technical expertise as valuable, that matters. For 3 years, we've been blamed for failures created by someone who didn't understand what we actually do. Having someone in authority acknowledge that our concerns were legitimate changes everything. Victoria nodded, understanding the full weight of what Reeves was saying. This wasn't just about vehicle maintenance or equipment readiness. It was about restoring dignity to personnel who'd been systematically undermined by leadership that had confused authority with competence. It was about rebuilding institutional trust in environments where that trust had been eroded by years of retaliation against people who raised legitimate concerns. The drive to Northern Command headquarters took 3 hours through terrain that shifted from military facility to civilian infrastructure to the administrative hub, where the strategic decisions affecting thousands of personnel were made. Victoria used the time to review her presentation one final time, ensuring that every element was precisely calibrated to communicate both the severity of what had occurred at Fort Ridgemont and the institutional significance of addressing it. By the time she arrived at Northern Command, the investigation into her actions had already been officially initiated. 3 senior officers had been assigned to review the evidence and determine whether her assumption of command had been justified and whether her methods had violated protocols that should have been followed. The meeting would determine not just the future of Colonel Harrington's career, but also the precedent for how the Army would address similar situations of toxic leadership in the future. Victoria took a seat in the conference room and began presenting the evidence that would reshape Fort Ridgemont and ultimately influence command accountability across the entire Northern Command region. The hydraulic system failure sat metaphorically at the center of everything she was about to explain. Proof that reality, once ignored, has a way of imposing itself on systems that refuse to acknowledge it. The conference room at Northern Command headquarters was arranged with the kind of deliberate formality that was designed to establish power dynamics before a single word was spoken. 3 senior officers sat behind a polished table, positioned to face Victoria across an expanse of dark wood that functioned as both physical barrier and symbolic representation of institutional authority. General Patricia Hutchins occupied the center position, her silver hair and weathered features marking her as someone who'd spent 4 decades navigating the complexities of military command. On her left sat Colonel Robert Ashton from the Inspector General's office, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the extensive documentation Victoria had submitted in advance of this meeting. On her right was Captain Marcus Wellington from the Judge Advocate General's office, his presence indicating that legal considerations would be central to whatever judgment emerged from this proceeding. General Hutchins opened the proceeding without preamble, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 3 decades of making life-altering decisions. Captain Ashford, you've submitted extensive documentation regarding systematic command failures at Fort Ridgemont. Before we proceed with reviewing that evidence, I need to understand your authorization for the methods you employed. You arrived at Fort Ridgemont under false identity, you conducted covert investigation of a commanding officer without his knowledge, and you ultimately relieved him of command without following standard notification and transition protocols. How do you justify these actions? Victoria had anticipated this line of questioning. The mechanics of command relief were important, but they obscured the deeper reality she needed to communicate. General Hutchins, I was operating under direct Pentagon authorization for covert assessment of systemic leadership failures. The methodology was specifically designed to allow observation of normal operations without the artificial preparation that accompanies announced inspections. Colonel Harrington's command structure had created an environment where normal reporting channels had become ineffective. Personnel who raised safety concerns faced career consequences. Junior officers who questioned his judgment were transferred or publicly humiliated. The only way to gather accurate information about what was actually happening at that facility was through methods that couldn't be filtered through his administrative apparatus. Colonel Ashton leaned forward, his expression suggesting he was genuinely interested in understanding her reasoning. Captain, you're essentially arguing that deceptive methods were necessary because normal institutional processes had been corrupted by the commanding officer in question. But that argument could justify covert operations against any commander someone in the Pentagon decides needs investigation. How do we establish appropriate standards for when such extraordinary measures are justified? It was exactly the right question, and Victoria understood that her answer would shape not just her own future but the precedent for institutional accountability across the entire military structure. Colonel Ashton, the standard should be imminent threat to personnel safety or operational readiness. At Fort Ridgemont, we were facing both. The maintenance records were being systematically falsified to hide safety violations. Equipment was being declared combat-ready despite not meeting safety specifications. Personnel were being transferred for raising legitimate technical concerns. And all of this was occurring under a command structure that had insulated itself from normal accountability mechanisms. Captain Wellington consulted his notes. Captain Ashford, the documentation you've submitted includes evidence of at least 17 instances where personnel filed formal safety reports that were either dismissed or resulted in the filer being transferred. Can you walk us through a specific example? Victoria opened the personnel file she'd brought, the case of Master Sergeant William Patterson. Master Sergeant Patterson filed a formal safety concern regarding deteriorating hydraulic systems on the M939 convoy vehicles. His report was technically accurate and represented legitimate professional judgment. Colonel Harrington responded by reassigning Patterson to a different motor pool section, effectively removing him from the vehicle maintenance chain. When Patterson persisted in raising concerns, he was documented as displaying difficulty accepting direction in his efficiency report. That's not necessarily retaliation, Colonel Ashton observed. It could be legitimate command decision-making. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It would be, Victoria replied, except that it occurred as part of a pattern. 17 personnel who raised safety concerns experienced similar reassignments, transfers, or documented disciplinary action within 30 days of raising those concerns. The probability of that being coincidental is statistically negligible. More significantly, the safety concerns were legitimate. The hydraulic system failure that occurred during diagnostic testing on Saturday morning validated every technical concern Patterson and others had raised. General Hutchins made notes on her tablet, then addressed Victoria directly. Captain Ashford, I want to discuss the personal dimension of your motivation for this assignment. You requested Fort Ridgemont specifically after learning about the death of Lieutenant Commander James Hartley. You believed his death was connected to toxic leadership at this facility. Can you explain how that personal motivation informed your assessment? This was the moment Victoria had been preparing for, the point where she needed to connect institutional analysis to human reality without allowing personal emotion to compromise her credibility. General James Hartley was an exceptional officer. His service record before arriving at Fort Ridgemont showed exemplary performance and professional judgment. Within 3 weeks of being assigned to Colonel Harrington's command, his efficiency evaluations shifted dramatically. He was being systematically criticized in front of his subordinates. His professional judgments were being questioned despite his technical expertise. His wife reported that he'd gone from confident leader to someone questioning his own competence. Victoria paused, allowing the weight of what she was describing to settle on the room. The official investigation into his death found no evidence of command failure or policy violation. But investigations can only examine what they're trained to look for. They examine procedures and protocols. They don't examine the subtle psychological dynamics that occur when someone in authority repeatedly undermines a subordinate's confidence despite objective evidence of their competence. James Hartley's death wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the predictable outcome of a toxic command climate that had been developing for 3 years. Colonel Ashton was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Victoria had described. "Captain, are you suggesting that the command climate at Fort Ridgemont directly contributed to Lieutenant Commander Hartley's death?" "I'm suggesting that the environment Harrington created significantly increased the psychological distress that contributed to Hartley's decision," Victoria replied carefully. "And I'm suggesting that the same environment had already begun affecting other personnel. We have documented cases of 3 additional military members experiencing severe psychological distress directly correlated with their interactions with Colonel Harrington." General Hutchins consulted with the other officers through subtle glances and minimal communication, the kind of wordless coordination that came from extensive experience working together. "Captain Ashford, let's discuss the specific evidence regarding the falsified maintenance records. Colonel Ashton has reviewed the documentation." "Colonel Ashton, your assessment." The Inspector General's representative opened his tablet and began reviewing the photographic evidence Victoria had submitted. "The falsification is systematic and undeniable. Inspection reports dated on days when the personnel supposedly signing them weren't at the facility. Maintenance work marked as completed in timeframes that would be physically impossible. Safety clearances signed by individuals who've testified they never conducted those inspections. This isn't administrative sloppiness. This is deliberate falsification of official military documentation." "Captain Wellington, what are the legal implications?" General Hutchins asked. The JAG officer reviewed his notes with the precision of someone trained to identify legal exposure and institutional liability. "The falsification of maintenance records constitutes fraud and potentially violates the Uniform Code of Military Justice. More significantly, if Colonel Harrington ordered personnel to falsify those records, he bears direct responsibility for the falsification. If he simply tolerated the falsification without investigating how his inspection protocols were being compromised, he bears responsibility for negligent command oversight. Either way, there's a clear case for formal investigation and potential court-martial proceedings." Victoria watched as the legal and operational implications of what had occurred at Fort Ridgemont began to crystallize in the minds of the 3 senior officers. This wasn't just about command style or personality conflicts. This was about systematic violation of military law and regulation, compounded by evidence that the violations had created an environment contributing to personnel casualties. "Captain Ashford, one final question before we break for deliberation," General Hutchins said. "You had the authority to simply report your findings through normal channels. Instead, you chose to assume direct command authority. Why?" Victoria understood that this was the critical question, the one that would determine whether she'd be seen as a hero or an overreaching officer who'd violated her authority. General, normal channels had proven ineffective over 18 months of prior reporting. Personnel had submitted safety concerns through appropriate command structures. Those concerns had been dismissed or ignored. Officers had filed efficiency reports contradicting the colonel's public statements about equipment readiness. Those reports had been suppressed. The normal institutional mechanisms for addressing command failures at Fort Ridgemont had been corrupted by the commanding officer in question. The only way to prevent deployment of unsafe vehicles and protect personnel from further psychological damage was through immediate intervention. She paused, making sure her next words carried their full weight. "I didn't assume command authority because I wanted it or because I disagreed with Colonel Harrington's management style. I assumed command authority because imminent threat to personnel safety and operational integrity required intervention that normal channels couldn't provide. And I was authorized by the Pentagon to make that determination." General Hutchins nodded slowly, acknowledging the logic while maintaining her institutional neutrality. "We're going to recess for 2 hours while we review the complete documentation and consult with our legal advisors. Captain Ashford, you'll remain available for any additional questions that emerge during our deliberations." As Victoria left the conference room, she understood that the decision being made in her absence would extend far beyond her own career trajectory. It would establish precedent for how the military addressed toxic leadership. It would determine whether institutional courage would be rewarded or punished. And it would influence whether future James Hartleys would be protected by systems designed to intervene in toxic command climates, or whether institutional loyalty to established authority would continue to supersede the safety and welfare of personnel. The waiting began, and with it, the full weight of what was at stake. The recess lasted 3 hours, though to Victoria it felt like compressed time, each minute containing the weight of potential consequences. She waited in a secured holding area adjacent to the main conference room, her mind cataloging the various outcomes that might emerge from the deliberations occurring behind closed doors. She'd presented her case with meticulous precision, supported by irrefutable documentation. But institutional politics operated according to rules that transcended evidence and logic. Officers protecting other officers. Careers defended through administrative channels. Reputations shielded by the very hierarchy she was challenging. When General Hutchins finally requested her return to the conference room, Victoria immediately recognized that the dynamic had shifted. The 3 officers were no longer sitting in formal opposition across the table from her. Instead, they'd arranged themselves in a more collegial configuration, with General Hutchins occupying a central position that suggested she'd assumed leadership of a unified decision. Captain Ashford, we've completed our review of all submitted documentation. General Hutchins began, her voice carrying a tone that suggested the deliberations had been thorough and contentious. Before we proceed to our findings, Colonel Ashton has some additional questions based on documentation that emerged during our review. Colonel Ashton opened a file that contained personnel transfer records, efficiency evaluations, and documented disciplinary actions spanning the entire 3-year period of Harrington's command at Fort Ridgemont. Captain Ashford, we've compiled a comprehensive analysis of personnel actions under Colonel Harrington's command, and the pattern you documented is even more systematic than the sample cases you provided. We're looking at 43 personnel who experienced either transfer, reassignment, or documented disciplinary action within 30 days of raising safety or technical concerns. Additionally, we've identified 12 officers who requested reassignment during Harrington's tenure, all citing command climate concerns in their exit interviews. Furthermore, Captain Wellington added, consulting his legal analysis, the falsification of maintenance records has broader implications than initially apparent. We've traced the systematic nature of the falsification through administrative email documentation. Colonel Harrington issued directives to maintenance personnel regarding timeline compliance that, while not explicitly ordering falsification, created conditions where personnel felt compelled to sign off on incomplete inspections rather than report delays. Victoria listened carefully, understanding that the officers were constructing a comprehensive case that extended beyond the specific evidence she'd presented. They were establishing a pattern of systemic failure that implicated not just isolated incidents but the fundamental structure of how Colonel Harrington had operated his command. Captain Ashford, I need to address something that will be significant to the outcome of this investigation, General Hutchins said, her expression serious. Your methods, the covert assessment, the false identity, the assumption of command without traditional notification, these actions represent an extraordinary departure from standard military protocols. The question before us is whether the results justify the methodology. This was the moment Victoria had been anticipating. Everything depended on how the institutional leadership evaluated the balance between procedural propriety and operational necessity. I understand the concern, General, Victoria replied carefully. My actions departed from standard protocol because standard protocols had proven ineffective at Fort Ridgemont. Personnel attempting to work within established channels had their concerns dismissed. Officers following proper reporting procedures had their judgments questioned and their careers damaged. The command structure had essentially insulated itself from accountability mechanisms that normally function to address toxic leadership. Colonel Ashton leaned forward. Captain, you're arguing that when normal institutional processes fail, extraordinary measures become justified. But what prevents other officers from using similar logic to justify their own interventions based on their assessment of institutional failure? The difference is authorization and oversight, Victoria replied. I was operating under direct Pentagon authorization for this specific mission. My actions were reviewed at the highest levels of military leadership before I assumed command, and I'm now being held accountable for my methodology through this formal investigation. Colonel Harrington operated without comparable oversight or accountability. He had 3 years to create systemic dysfunction with minimal institutional resistance. General Hutchins made notes, then addressed both her colleagues and Victoria simultaneously. This investigation has reached several critical conclusions. First, the documentation establishes systematic falsification of military maintenance records. Second, the pattern of personnel actions demonstrates retaliatory treatment of individuals who raised legitimate safety and technical concerns. Third, the command climate created by Colonel Harrington contributed to psychological harm affecting multiple personnel, including at least one individual whose death occurred in direct temporal relationship to documented psychological distress created by command interactions. She paused, allowing the full weight of those conclusions to settle. Fourth, Captain Ashford's assumption of command authority was justified by imminent threat to personnel safety and operational readiness. The hydraulic system failure that occurred after her intervention validates her assessment that vehicles were being deployed without proper maintenance and safety verification. Captain Wellington then presented the legal judgment. Based on the documentation submitted, Colonel Harrington's actions constitute violation of military code regarding falsification of official records, potential negligent endangerment of personnel, and systematic command failure. The recommendation of this office is that formal charges be filed and that a court-martial be convened to determine appropriate sanctions. However, Colonel Ashton added, his tone shifting to acknowledge a complicating factor. We also need to address the broader institutional implications of this case. Colonel Harrington was not operating in a vacuum. He received efficiency ratings that were approved by his superior officers. His deployment timelines were established by Northern Command. The institutional structure that enabled his failures included oversight mechanisms that failed to detect and address the problems. This was the moment where Victoria understood the investigation would expand beyond individual accountability to systemic responsibility. Colonel Harrington would face consequences, but the military structure that had tolerated his conduct would also face scrutiny. Captain Ashford, this investigation is recommending 3 major institutional responses, General Hutchins said formally. First, formal charges will be filed against Colonel Harrington for falsification of records, negligent command oversight, and violations of military code regarding treatment of subordinate personnel. Second, a comprehensive review will be initiated of command climate assessment procedures across Northern Command to identify similar patterns of toxic leadership. Third, your methodology for covert assessment will be formally adopted as standard procedure for investigating suspected command failures at facilities showing similar warning signs. Victoria felt the significance of what General Hutchins was saying. The precedent she'd established would shape how the military addressed institutional dysfunction going forward. Her methods, controversial though they were, would become institutionalized. Furthermore, General Hutchins continued, this investigation finds that your assumption of command authority at Fort Ridgemont was justified and appropriate given the circumstances. However, your continued presence at that facility is complicated by the fact that you're now implicated in the investigation of Colonel Harrington's conduct. Therefore, you're being reassigned to assume command of the USS Hartford, a guided missile destroyer currently undergoing refit at Naval Station San Diego. The assignment recognizes both your command capability and your demonstrated commitment to addressing toxic leadership patterns. The reassignment caught Victoria off guard. She'd expected vindication, but reassignment to operational command rather than promotion to flag rank was unexpected. Before she could fully process the implications, General Hutchins continued, Captain, I need you to understand something, the general said, her voice carrying personal weight beyond her official capacity. I've spent 35 years in military service watching good officers destroy their careers by raising legitimate concerns about systemic problems. I've seen talented personnel transferred because they questioned the judgment of senior leaders. I've watched institutional loyalty trump institutional integrity too many times. What you did at Fort Ridgemont, what you risked to do, required the kind of institutional courage that's become rare in military leadership. She paused, acknowledging the complexity of what she was saying. That doesn't mean your methods were perfect. That doesn't mean there aren't legitimate questions about the precedent you've established. But it means that sometimes the alternatives to extraordinary measures are worse than the measures themselves. And this investigation recognizes that fundamental truth. Colonel Ashton added his own perspective. Captain Ashford, your covert assessment methodology will become standard procedure for investigating command failures that show warning signs similar to what you documented at Fort Ridgemont. Personnel will be trained in these techniques. Institutional oversight will be established. What you developed here represents a significant advance in how the military can address toxic leadership while maintaining operational continuity. Captain Wellington contributed the final component. The charges against Colonel Harrington will proceed through formal court-martial. You'll likely be required to testify regarding your observations and documentation. But this office is confident that the evidence you've gathered will support conviction on the most serious charges. Colonel Harrington's military career, as he knew it, is essentially concluded. As Victoria left the conference room, she understood that the institutional judgment had been rendered. She'd been vindicated. Her methods had been validated and institutionalized. Colonel Harrington would face consequences for his conduct. But the broader implications extended far beyond individual accountability. The military had recognized that addressing toxic leadership required institutional courage, even when that courage involved departing from established protocols. However, Victoria also understood that this vindication came with new responsibilities. She would now command a guided missile destroyer, implementing the same principles that had guided her intervention at Fort Ridgemont. She would establish command climates where technical expertise was valued rather than threatened. She would create environments where personnel could raise legitimate concerns without fear of retaliation. She would prove that the methods she developed weren't just about removing toxic leaders, but about building command structures where competence and safety took precedence over political convenience. The transformation of Fort Ridgemont had been the catalyst. But the real work was just beginning. The formal investigation into Colonel Derek Harrington's conduct at Fort Ridgemont commenced 3 weeks after General Hutchins's institutional findings, with proceedings convened in a military courtroom that carried the austere formality of institutions designed to render judgment on matters of profound consequence. The charges had been finalized and filed with meticulous precision: falsification of official military records, negligent endangerment of personnel, systematic command failure, and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice regarding treatment of subordinate officers. The court-martial itself represented a rare institutional acknowledgement that rank and seniority did not exempt senior officers from accountability when their conduct undermined the fundamental principles of military service. Victoria attended the proceedings not as a combatant seeking personal vindication, but as the primary witness whose documentation and testimony would establish the factual foundation for the charges. She'd spent weeks preparing her presentation with the same meticulous attention to detail that had defined her Navy SEAL career. Every piece of evidence was organized chronologically. Every personnel account was cross-referenced with documentary corroboration. Every technical assessment was supported by independent verification from qualified engineers. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They presented the photographic documentation of falsified maintenance records, inspection reports signed on dates when the personnel supposedly conducting the inspections weren't even at Fort Ridgemont. They introduced maintenance logs claiming work completion in timeframes that would have been physically impossible. They presented testimony from Master Sergeant Reeves describing how Colonel Harrington had pressured him to sign off on incomplete inspections to meet arbitrary deployment timelines. But more damaging than the mechanical documentation were the personnel accounts. Soldiers who'd been transferred for raising legitimate safety concerns testified about the retaliation they'd experienced. Officers who'd submitted technical assessments contradicting Harrington's public statements described how those assessments had been suppressed or distorted in official efficiency reports. Support staff recounted instances of public humiliation designed to intimidate rather than educate. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the hydraulic system failure that had occurred on the M939 convoy vehicle. An independent expert witness, a mechanical engineer with expertise in military vehicle systems, testified that the deterioration evident in the failed components was entirely consistent with deferred maintenance over an extended period. The failure, the expert testified, would have been entirely predictable if proper inspection and replacement procedures had not been conducted. Could this failure have occurred if maintenance protocols had been properly followed? The prosecutor asked. No, absolutely not, the expert replied. The deterioration we're seeing is the direct result of extended periods without proper inspection and maintenance. If standard protocols had been implemented, replacement would have occurred before any significant deterioration developed. The failure we're examining represents systematic neglect of basic maintenance procedures. When Colonel Harrington took the stand in his own defense, Victoria watched as a man confronted the gap between the narrative he'd constructed about his command performance and the objective reality documented throughout the proceedings. He argued that he'd been responding to timeline pressures from Northern Command. He claimed that personnel who'd been transferred had requested reassignment for personal reasons. He suggested that the maintenance protocols had been followed to the extent operationally feasible. But the documentation contradicted each claim with methodical precision. Messages from Northern Command established that the deployment timelines, while ambitious, did not require cutting corners on safety. Personnel files showed that officers had been transferred immediately after raising specific technical concerns. Maintenance records demonstrated that protocols could have been followed had personnel simply been allowed adequate time to complete work properly. The prosecution's closing argument articulated the fundamental institutional failure that Victoria had identified in her covert assessment. Colonel Harrington created a command environment where technical expertise was viewed as an obstacle rather than an asset, where personnel who raised legitimate safety concerns faced career consequences, where vehicles were certified as combat-ready based on paperwork rather than actual system functionality. And all of this was tolerated by a command structure that failed to exercise adequate oversight of a subordinate officer's conduct. The prosecutor paused, ensuring that the gravity of what he was describing fully registered. The question before this court is whether military officers can be held accountable when their command decisions prioritize political considerations and schedule compliance over the safety and welfare of personnel. The evidence presented here establishes that Colonel Harrington's answer to that question has been no, that rank and seniority should exempt him from accountability. But military justice requires a different answer. Military personnel deserve command structures that prioritize their safety and welfare. Colonel Harrington failed to provide that structure, and he must be held accountable for that failure. The military judge, a senior officer with 30 years of experience evaluating command conduct, deliberated for 3 days before rendering his verdict. When the decision came, it was comprehensive and unambiguous. Colonel Harrington was found guilty on all counts. The falsification of maintenance records was established beyond reasonable doubt. The negligent endangerment of personnel was substantiated by the technical evidence regarding the vehicle failures. The systematic retaliation against personnel who raised safety concerns was corroborated by multiple witness testimonies. The sentencing phase brought additional considerations. Military law permitted a range of sanctions, from formal reprimand to dishonorable discharge and imprisonment. The judge, in announcing the sentence, made clear that the consequences reflected the severity of Harrington's institutional failure. Colonel Harrington, you have been found guilty of falsification of official military records, negligent endangerment of personnel, and systematic violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. These findings reflect not isolated incidents of poor judgment, but rather a sustained pattern of command conduct that undermined the fundamental principles of military leadership. You prioritized your own career advancement and reputation over the safety and welfare of personnel under your command. You created an environment where competent personnel were afraid to raise legitimate concerns. And you systematically falsified official documentation to conceal the reality of your command failures. The judge paused, emphasizing the institutional significance of the sentence he was about to pronounce. It is the judgment of this court that you be dishonorably discharged from the United States military, that you forfeit all rank and military privileges, and that you serve a sentence of 5 years imprisonment for violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Furthermore, your military retirement and pension are hereby forfeited, and you are barred from federal employment in perpetuity. The sentence was staggering in its comprehensiveness. Dishonorable discharge was the military equivalent of a felony conviction, a permanent mark on an individual's record that would affect employment, housing, and civic standing for the remainder of their life. The forfeiture of pension eliminated the financial security that had been the reward for 31 years of service. The bar from federal employment ensured that Harrington could never transition to a second career in government service. But as Victoria observed the institutional judgment being rendered, she understood that the severity of the sentence reflected something deeper than punishment for individual wrongdoing. It represented institutional acknowledgement that toxic leadership had consequences. That rank did not exempt officers from accountability. That personnel welfare took precedence over career protection. Colonel Harrington's face had gone pale as the judge pronounced the sentence. His attorney touched his arm, speaking quietly about appeal processes and legal options, but Harrington seemed to be processing the full reality of what had just occurred. 31 years of military service, compressed into a sentence that eliminated not just his career but his identity as a military officer. Master Sergeant Reeves, who had attended the court-martial as a witness and observer, caught Victoria's eye across the courtroom gallery. The recognition in his expression went beyond vindication. It reflected something more fundamental, the acknowledgement that institutional courage had finally prevailed over institutional loyalty to established authority. As Victoria left the courtroom, she understood that this judgment represented a watershed moment for the military institution itself. Colonel Harrington's conviction would become a case study at military academies. The procedures Victoria had developed for identifying toxic leadership would be institutionalized across multiple command structures. The message being sent was clear and unambiguous. Military leaders would be held accountable for creating toxic command climates, regardless of their rank or seniority. But Victoria also understood something more sobering. The institutional judgment that had been rendered today would have come too late for James Hartley. It would have come too late for the officers who'd been transferred unfairly. It would have come too late for the personnel who'd experienced psychological trauma from years of working under Harrington's command. Institutional accountability, while important, did not undo the human damage that toxic leadership created. The transformation of Fort Ridgemont had been necessary and valuable, but it had also come at a human cost that extended beyond the scope of any military verdict. And as Victoria departed the courtroom to assume her new command of the USS Hartford, she carried with her the recognition that preventing future James Hartleys required more than just removing toxic leaders. It required building institutional structures where toxic leadership could never develop in the first place. That work would define the next phase of her military career. The transformation of Fort Ridgemont began in earnest 3 days after Colonel Harrington's court-martial conviction, with Victoria returning to the facility she'd entered as an invisible mechanic barely 4 weeks earlier. But she returned now with the formal authority that her presence had always implied: full command authority and the backing of institutional leadership committed to systemic reform. The personnel who'd lived under Harrington's toxic command for 3 years gathered in the base auditorium, a crowd numbering approximately 900 soldiers, civilian contractors, and support staff, all of whom understood that something fundamental had shifted in the institutional structure they inhabited. Victoria took the podium at exactly 0800 hours, her uniform bearing the insignia of her permanent assignment as commanding officer pending her transfer to the USS Hartford. The promotion had come through overnight along with expanded authority to implement whatever changes were necessary to restore Fort Ridgemont to full operational and institutional health. She'd spent the previous evening reviewing the structural deficiencies she'd identified during her covert assessment, designing reforms that would address not just the immediate crisis, but the underlying systemic problems that had enabled Harrington's failures. "Personnel of Fort Ridgemont," she began, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium sound system. Approximately 4 weeks ago, this facility was operating under command structures that prioritized deadline compliance over safety, political consideration over technical competence, and institutional loyalty over institutional integrity. That changed when we discovered that vehicles scheduled for combat deployment had hydraulic systems operating outside safe parameters because maintenance protocols were being systematically falsified. The auditorium fell silent. Some personnel had known the details of the vehicle failure and the subsequent investigation. Others had only heard rumors, but none had understood the full scope of what Victoria was describing until this moment. Colonel Harrington has been convicted of falsification of official military records, negligent endangerment of personnel, and systematic violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Victoria continued. He's been dishonorably discharged from military service. His pension has been forfeited, and he's serving a 5-year sentence for violations that placed each and every one of you at risk. In the front row, Master Sergeant Reeves nodded grimly. Behind him, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun and the other junior officers who'd attempted to raise safety concerns throughout Harrington's command finally heard someone in authority acknowledge what they'd been fighting against. As of this moment, Fort Ridgemont operates under new command principles, Victoria announced. Safety first, always. Competence over compliance. Technical accuracy over political convenience. And absolute honesty in all reporting, regardless of whether that honesty makes timelines more difficult or creates complications for higher command. Victoria could see the psychological shift happening in real time. Shoulders straightening, eyes brightening. The subtle transformation that occurred when competent people were finally allowed to do their jobs correctly without fear of retaliation or having their expertise subordinated to political considerations. I know some of you have lost faith in military leadership over the past 3 years, Victoria continued. You've seen good ideas ignored. You've seen safety concerns dismissed. You've seen professional expertise subordinated to the ego of a commanding officer who confused authority with competence. That changes now. She gestured toward the projection screen, where organizational charts appeared, showing the new command structure she designed during her covert assessment phase. The reforms were comprehensive and intentional. They eliminated unnecessary bureaucratic layers that had allowed Harrington to insulate himself from accountability. They established direct reporting relationships between technical specialists and command authority. They created clear lines of authority based on expertise rather than seniority alone. Master Sergeant Reeves, you are now the senior technical advisor for all vehicle operations. Your technical assessments will go directly to my office with no intermediate review or political filtering, Victoria announced. The promotion in responsibilities recognized what Reeves had always been, the actual operational expert who'd been forced to function under impossible command constraints. Reeves's eyes widened slightly, acknowledging both the recognition and the weight of responsibility being placed on him. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, you're promoted to full commander and appointed as operations officer for the entire facility, Victoria continued. The promotion was 2 ranks ahead of normal timeline progression, but it recognized that Chun had been doing the job of a commander while being blamed for decisions made above her authority level. Around the auditorium, Victoria could see the impact of her announcements. Personnel who'd been marginalized under the previous command structure were being elevated to positions where their expertise actually mattered. The message being communicated was unmistakable. Competence would be rewarded, not punished. We're also implementing immediate reforms to address the cultural problems that created this crisis, Victoria said, transitioning to the structural changes that would prevent future toxic leadership from developing at Fort Ridgemont. Anonymous safety reporting system with direct access to my office. Monthly all-hands meetings where anyone can raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Quarterly efficiency reviews based on actual performance metrics, rather than political considerations or personality conflicts. Each reform represented a direct repudiation of Harrington's command philosophy. Where he had demanded unquestioning loyalty and compliance, Victoria was creating systems that rewarded initiative and honesty. Where he had centralized all decision-making in his office, she was distributing authority to people with actual expertise. Where he had created environments where raising concerns meant career damage, she was establishing mechanisms that protected whistleblowers and rewarded people who identified problems early. I also want to address something that shouldn't need to be said, but apparently does, Victoria said, her voice carrying a note of personal conviction that resonated through the auditorium. This facility serves the United States military. Your loyalty is to the mission, to your fellow personnel, and to the safety of everyone who depends on our work. Not to personalities. Not to politics. Not to anyone who asks you to compromise your professional standards for their convenience. It was a direct repudiation of the personality cult that had developed around Harrington. The expectation that personal loyalty to the commanding officer mattered more than adherence to professional standards and institutional integrity. The M939 convoy vehicles will remain in maintenance for as long as necessary to meet full safety specifications, Victoria announced. I know this creates complications for Northern Command's deployment schedule. I know it creates political pressure from higher command. But this facility will not deploy unsafe vehicles regardless of those pressures. Safety comes first. Mission effectiveness comes second. Everything else is negotiable. The statement drew murmurs of approval from personnel who'd spent 3 years being pressured to prioritize timelines over safety. For the first time in months, they would be allowed to do their jobs without cutting corners or ignoring problems. I'm also implementing a comprehensive personnel review to identify and address the effects of the retaliatory command practices that occurred under the previous structure, Victoria continued. Officers who were transferred unfairly will have the opportunity to appeal those transfers. Efficiency reports that were distorted due to retaliation will be reevaluated. Personnel whose careers were damaged by reporting legitimate safety concerns will have those concerns addressed and documented. This final reform represented perhaps the most significant institutional acknowledgement that toxic leadership had created widespread damage that extended beyond the immediate crisis. It recognized that rebuilding trust in command structures required not just removing toxic leaders, but actively working to repair the damage they'd created. Questions? Victoria asked, opening the proceeding to personnel input in a way that would have been unthinkable under Harrington's command. Master Sergeant Reeves raised his hand. Captain, what's the timeline for completing the comprehensive hydraulic system overhaul on the M939 vehicles? Whatever timeline is necessary to do the job right, Victoria replied. Master Sergeant, you and your team know what proper maintenance requires. I'm authorizing you to implement that standard without artificial deadline pressure. If it takes 3 weeks, it takes 3 weeks. If it takes 6 weeks, it takes 6 weeks. Safety standards don't negotiate with deployment schedules. Lieutenant Commander Chun raised her next question. Ma'am, what about personnel who were involved in falsifying maintenance records? How do we handle accountability without destroying careers? It was a thoughtful question that went to the heart of leadership philosophy, the balance between accountability and rehabilitation, between punishment and education. Everyone who falsified records will face appropriate administrative action, Victoria replied. But we're also going to implement training programs to ensure everyone understands why those records matter. Accountability includes education, not just punishment. We're going to rebuild a command culture where people understand that integrity in documentation is fundamental to safety and mission effectiveness. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes, with questions ranging from technical procedures to personnel policies. But the underlying theme remained consistent throughout. Competence would be rewarded, honesty would be protected, and the mission would take precedence over politics or personal convenience. When the meeting concluded, Victoria watched the personnel file out with something approaching hope. These were good people who'd been trapped in a dysfunctional system. Given proper leadership and clear standards based on competence rather than personality, they would excel. The transformation of Fort Ridgemont had begun, and it would ripple outward, influencing how other military facilities approached the balance between authority and competence, between institutional loyalty and institutional integrity. The demonstration of Captain Victoria Ashford's expanded influence came 6 weeks after the institutional reforms at Fort Ridgemont, when the Pentagon dispatched its most demanding evaluator to assess the facility's operational transformation. Brigadier General Catherine Monroe arrived on a gray Thursday morning with a reputation that preceded her like a storm front. Known throughout the military as the standard setter, Monroe had evaluated more commands than budget cuts and personnel changes combined. Her inspections were legendary for their thoroughness, her standards impossibly high, her tolerance for excuses non-existent. Military personnel throughout Northern Command spoke of her inspections the way ancient sailors might have discussed encounters with legendary sea creatures, with a mixture of fear and grudging respect for someone whose judgment could reshape entire command structures. Victoria met her at the airfield personally, recognizing both the opportunity and the threat that Monroe's visit represented. Word had spread through military channels about the command change at Fort Ridgemont, the court-martial conviction of Colonel Harrington, and the systematic reforms being implemented. Monroe's inspection would determine whether those changes represented genuine institutional improvement or merely cosmetic adjustments to underlying dysfunction. The evaluation would also carry implications that extended beyond Fort Ridgemont itself, potentially establishing precedent for how other military facilities should be structured and operated. Brigadier General Monroe, Victoria said as Monroe stepped off the transport helicopter, her uniform impeccable despite the journey and the wind whipping across the tarmac. "Fort Ridgemont stands ready for your evaluation." Monroe returned the salute with the crisp precision of someone who'd spent 4 decades in military service. "Captain Ashford, I trust you're prepared for a comprehensive assessment of your facility's operational capabilities and command climate." Victoria had spent the previous 6 weeks implementing training protocols she'd developed during her assessment work at Fort Ridgemont. Not the kind of superficial preparation that focused on appearances and paperwork, but deep institutional changes that addressed the fundamental problems Harrington's command had created. Every personnel action during the previous 3 years had been documented and analyzed. Every instance of retaliation had been identified and addressed. Every distorted efficiency report had been reevaluated against objective performance criteria. The inspection began in the vehicle maintenance bay, where the M939 convoy trucks remained in various stages of repair. Monroe examined the work with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 4 decades evaluating military operations. Her questions probed every detail of the maintenance process, the safety protocols being implemented, and the timelines personnel were following. "Commander Chun," Monroe said, approaching the officer who was overseeing the comprehensive vehicle assessment, "explain your maintenance protocols for the M939 hydraulic systems." Chun straightened, her confidence evident as she launched into a detailed explanation of procedures that had been completely overhauled under Victoria's command. Gone were the shortcuts and compromises that had characterized Harrington's regime, replaced by meticulous adherence to specifications that prioritized safety over schedule compliance. "And who approved these enhanced protocols?" Monroe asked, her tone suggesting she expected to find unauthorized deviations from standard procedures. "Captain Ashford personally reviewed and approved every modification," Chun replied. "She required us to exceed minimum standards rather than merely meet them. The protocols now incorporate independent verification steps that weren't present in the previous maintenance structure." Monroe made notes on her tablet, her expression unreadable. In her 30 years of conducting inspections, she'd rarely encountered commanding officers who demanded higher standards than required by regulation. Most tried to find ways to meet minimum requirements with maximum efficiency, prioritizing timeline compliance over technical excellence. The inspection continued through every department and system at Fort Ridgemont. Monroe examined maintenance records with forensic intensity, interviewed personnel at every level, and tested Victoria's knowledge of technical systems that many commanding officers would delegate to subordinates. In the communications center, she questioned Chun about the direct reporting procedure Victoria had implemented for safety concerns. "Explain this anonymous reporting system," Monroe demanded. Chun pulled up the database Victoria had created, showing the reporting mechanism that allowed any personnel to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Captain Ashford established direct channels for safety reporting that bypass traditional hierarchies. Every report receives immediate attention and investigation. We maintain complete confidentiality for reporters unless they consent to being identified. "How many reports have you received since implementation?" Monroe asked. 73, Chun replied. "All investigated. 58 resulted in immediate corrections. 15 required additional technical analysis. 0 were dismissed without investigation." Monroe raised an eyebrow. In her experience, most commands either received no safety reports, indicating personnel were afraid to report problems, or dismissed most reports as minor issues not worth investigating. A system that encouraged reporting and acted on every concern represented a fundamental shift in command culture from what she typically encountered. The real test came during a comprehensive emergency response simulation. Monroe announced that she wanted to observe Fort Ridgemont's response to a critical vehicle system failure during deployment preparation. Victoria personally led the drill, her knowledge of mechanical systems evident as she coordinated responses to simulated emergencies with the precision of someone who understood every component, every safety margin, and every potential failure mode. "Captain Ashford," Monroe said after watching her direct a complex emergency assessment scenario, "where did you acquire your technical vehicle systems expertise?" "I made it my business to understand every system under my command, General," Victoria replied. I can't make informed decisions about vehicle safety if I don't understand vehicle engineering. It's not optional competence for a commanding officer. It's fundamental responsibility. It was a philosophy that separated Victoria from officers who relied solely on subordinates' expertise without bothering to develop their own technical knowledge. She'd spent weeks studying technical manuals, attending training sessions with her vehicle maintenance technicians, learning the details that many commanding officers considered beneath their attention. But Monroe wasn't finished testing her capabilities. I want to see your emergency response to multiple simultaneous vehicle system failures, she announced. Full simulation, all systems, maximum complexity. It was the kind of test that could expose any weaknesses in training, preparation, or command competence. Victoria accepted the challenge without hesitation. All personnel, this is the captain. Her voice echoed through the base communication system. Emergency drill. Multiple vehicle system failures. Assume full deployment operations have been compromised. All personnel implement emergency response protocols immediately. This is not a drill for evaluation purposes. What followed was a demonstration of institutional competence that impressed even Monroe's demanding standards. Emergency response teams mobilized with precision timing. Maintenance personnel implemented diagnostic procedures with systematic methodology. Communication channels operated flawlessly despite the introduced complications. Victoria coordinated the entire response from the emergency command center, her decisions based on real-time data and technical analysis rather than predetermined scripts. When Monroe introduced complications, simulated equipment failures, personnel injuries, communication disruptions, missing critical information, Victoria adapted smoothly. Her responses demonstrated both technical knowledge and leadership capability. When additional complications cascaded, she prioritized effectively, making decisions about resource allocation and risk management with the kind of clarity that came from understanding both the technical and human dimensions of military operations. Time to complete emergency resolution, Monroe asked when the simulation ended. 12 minutes 47 seconds. A junior officer reported from the operations center. Significantly faster than our baseline performance metrics. Monroe consulted her tablet, comparing the results to fleet standards. Fort Ridgemont had just exceeded the performance metrics of bases with twice the resources and years more experience with emergency procedures. The transformation from Harrington's command performance metrics to what she was observing suggested not just procedural improvements but fundamental changes in how the facility operated. Captain Ashford, Monroe said formally, I need to understand how you achieved this level of operational readiness in 6 weeks. The transformation from your predecessor's performance metrics to what I've observed today suggests fundamental changes in command structure and personnel capability. Victoria gestured toward the personnel still at their stations despite the drill being officially concluded. General, competent people will excel when given proper leadership and clear standards. The capability was always here. It just needed to be properly directed and supported rather than constrained by command structures that prioritized appearance over substance. And the command climate changes? Monroe continued, her interest clearly extending beyond technical performance to the institutional culture Victoria had created. We eliminated the structures that permitted retaliation against personnel who raised legitimate concerns, Victoria replied. We established systems that rewarded technical expertise rather than punished it. We separated the concept of command authority from the concept of personal loyalty. Personnel now understand that their primary obligation is to the mission and to their fellow service members, not to any individual officer's career advancement or reputation protection. Monroe spent another 3 hours reviewing additional documentation, interviewing more personnel, and examining the reforms Victoria had implemented. Every question revealed additional evidence of institutional transformation that extended far beyond cosmetic changes to underlying cultural shifts. When she finally completed her evaluation, Monroe requested a private meeting with Victoria in her command office. Her expression remained professional as she reviewed her notes and prepared her official assessment. Captain Ashford, she said finally, in 30 years of conducting facility inspections, I have never observed such dramatic improvement in operational capability and command climate over such a compressed time frame. She paused, choosing her words with meticulous care. Your predecessor's final inspection report rated this facility as marginally acceptable for operational deployment. Based on what I've observed today, Fort Ridgemont now exceeds performance standards for bases twice the size with significantly more resources and years more stability. Victoria felt the professional satisfaction that came with validation that her approach to command actually worked, that competence could triumph over politics, that good people would excel when given proper leadership and clear institutional support. More importantly, Captain, Monroe continued, your personnel demonstrate the kind of institutional confidence that comes from knowing their leadership will support them in doing their jobs correctly. That level of command trust typically takes years to develop. The fact that you've achieved it in 6 weeks suggests leadership capabilities that extend far beyond standard command competence. Monroe leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting to something more thoughtful. Captain, Pacific Fleet Command and the Pentagon have been monitoring the situation at Fort Ridgemont very carefully. The command relief, the court-martial conviction, the systematic institutional reforms, all of it has attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership. Your work here has demonstrated that toxic command cultures can be transformed quickly when proper leadership is applied. That demonstration has implications far beyond Fort Ridgemont itself. Victoria understood immediately. Her success at Fort Ridgemont wouldn't just restore one facility to operational readiness. It would become a model for addressing similar problems throughout military commands. The methods she'd developed, the reforms she'd implemented, the cultural changes she'd achieved would be studied, replicated, and applied wherever institutional dysfunction threatened operational capability. 2 years after Captain Victoria Ashford's covert arrival at Fort Ridgemont, she stood on the bridge of the USS Hartford as her guided missile destroyer glided through Pacific waters with the silent precision that had made her crew legendary throughout the fleet. The ship's reactor hummed with perfect efficiency. Every safety protocol functioning exactly as designed. Every system monitored by personnel who understood that technical excellence wasn't optional. It was survival itself. The transformation that had begun at Fort Ridgemont had rippled through the entire military structure like waves from a depth charge, reshaping how commanders approached the fundamental relationship between authority and competence. Fort Ridgemont itself had become a case study. Military academies taught the facility's transformation. Naval War College courses analyzed Victoria's methodology for identifying and addressing toxic leadership. Junior officers studied the command relief procedures she'd pioneered. Her work had established precedent that extended far beyond vehicle maintenance and emergency response protocols. It had fundamentally altered how the military institution approached the balance between institutional loyalty and institutional integrity. But the real measure of success wasn't in policy manuals or academic papers. It was in the faces of the sailors who served under commanders who'd learned that competence mattered more than politics. It was in the personnel who'd experienced leadership that valued their expertise rather than threatened it. It was in the young officers entering military service understanding from the beginning that their primary obligation was to the mission and to their fellow service members, not to any individual officer's career advancement. Captain, Lieutenant Commander James Torres called from the navigation station. Torres, who had followed Victoria from Fort Ridgemont to the USS Hartford, had earned his commission through the merit-based advancement program Victoria had helped establish at Fort Ridgemont. We're approaching the rendezvous coordinates for the Fort Ridgemont inspection tour. Victoria smiled at the symmetry. 2 years ago, she'd been arriving at Fort Ridgemont as an invisible mechanic. Now she was returning as the commanding officer of one of the Pacific Fleet's most capable vessels, coming to witness the institutional transformation that had occurred at the facility she'd rehabilitated. Take us to periscope depth, Lieutenant Commander, Victoria ordered. Let's see what they've built. The periscope revealed a sight that filled Victoria with quiet professional satisfaction. The motor pool that had operated under impossible constraints now functioned with systematic excellence. The M939 vehicles that had been scheduled for unsafe deployment were now fully operational, having undergone complete overhauls that exceeded minimum safety standards. The facility itself carried the unmistakable presence of competent leadership, clean operations, efficient procedures, personnel who moved with the confidence that came from knowing their leadership prioritized their safety above all political considerations. Signal from Fort Ridgemont, Torres reported. Commander Reeves sends his compliments and requests permission to demonstrate the vehicle maintenance protocols. Reeves, Master Sergeant Reeves, had earned his commission during the institutional reforms that followed Victoria's intervention. He was now the commanding officer of Fort Ridgemont, a position he would have been denied under Harrington's regime because his technical expertise represented a threat rather than an asset. His command of the facility represented the ultimate validation of Victoria's philosophy, that competence should be rewarded, not punished. Permission granted, Victoria replied, and signal our congratulations on their recent deployment success. The facility's recent deployment to forward operations had been flawless. 3 months of operational excellence without a single safety incident. Maintenance performed to standards that had impressed even skeptical inspectors. It was proof that the Fort Ridgemont model worked not just in controlled environments, but in operational conditions where lives and national security depended on technical competence and institutional integrity. Victoria's secure communication system chimed with an incoming message from the Pentagon. The sender was Admiral Rachel Kellerman, who'd sponsored Victoria's original assignment to Fort Ridgemont and who'd watched the institutional reforms unfold with the satisfaction of someone who'd recognized the necessity of extraordinary measures to address systemic failure. Captain Reeves, I wanted to personally inform you that the Secretary of Defense has approved fleet-wide implementation of the Fort Ridgemont protocols. Kellerman's message began. Every military facility with vehicle or equipment maintenance responsibilities will be required to adopt your safety and command frameworks within the next 18 months. The institutional changes you pioneered are becoming standard operating procedure throughout the entire military structure. The announcement represented complete vindication of everything Victoria had fought for, not just at Fort Ridgemont, but throughout her entire military career dedicated to proving that technical competence could triumph over political convenience and that institutional courage could reshape military culture itself. Furthermore, the message continued. The Department of Defense has created the Institutional Courage Award to be presented annually to commands that exemplify the standards you've established. The first recipient will be announced at the Naval Academy graduation ceremony next month, where you'll be delivering the keynote address on leadership and the balance between authority and competence. Victoria accepted the information with professional composure while processing the profound implications. Speaking to the next generation of naval officers at the Academy would provide an opportunity to articulate the principles that had defined her military service. The conviction that authority without competence was dangerous, that institutional loyalty meant protecting the mission rather than protecting incompetent leaders, and that sometimes doing the right thing required methods that made traditional officers uncomfortable. The message concluded with additional information. We've also received word that Colonel Derek Harrington has been released from military detention after serving his court-martial sentence. He's requested permission to establish a consulting firm providing training on command climate assessment and the identification of toxic leadership patterns. His request has been approved, with the understanding that he'll use his experience as a cautionary example for military leaders. The final piece of information struck Victoria with unexpected complexity. Harrington's redemption, if it could be called that, represented something both charitable and pragmatic. A failed leader using his failure to educate others. Not glamorous, not career-enhancing, but genuinely valuable for institutional learning. His consulting work would ensure that the mistakes he'd made at Fort Ridgemont would be studied and understood by future military leaders, preventing similar patterns from developing elsewhere. Victoria composed a response to Admiral Kellerman acknowledging the institutional validation while reflecting on the deeper meaning of the changes that had occurred. Admiral, the credit for Fort Ridgemont's transformation belongs to everyone who chose competence over politics, safety over convenience, and institutional integrity over personal loyalty. The protocols we developed were simply formalized versions of principles that should have guided military leadership from the beginning. The challenge now is ensuring that these principles become the standard expectation rather than the exceptional achievement. Over the following weeks, Victoria's preparation for the Naval Academy address deepened her understanding of the institutional transformation she'd catalyzed. She reviewed the policy changes that had been implemented. She studied the personnel advancement programs that now rewarded technical expertise and institutional courage rather than punishing it. She examined the command climate assessment procedures that were being implemented across military facilities to identify toxic leadership patterns before they metastasized into systemic dysfunction. But she also spent time reflecting on what had been lost in the process of institutional reform. The personnel who'd left military service during Harrington's command would not return. The careers that had been derailed by retaliation would not be fully restored despite administrative corrections. The lives disrupted by working in toxic command environments could not be completely repaired through policy changes alone. James Hartley, the SEAL officer whose death had motivated Victoria's original assignment, remained the human reminder of what was at stake when military institutions tolerated toxic leadership. His death couldn't be undone by institutional reforms, no matter how comprehensive. But those reforms could prevent future James Hartleys from experiencing similar trajectories of psychological harm leading to devastating outcomes. When Victoria stood at the podium of the Naval Academy's graduation ceremony, facing an audience of newly commissioned officers beginning their military careers, she carried with her the weight of institutional responsibility and personal experience. "Midshipman," she began, her voice carrying through the auditorium with the authority of someone who'd lived the principles she was describing. "You're entering military service at a moment when the institution is undergoing fundamental transformation regarding how it approaches the relationship between command authority and institutional integrity. You've studied the Fort Ridgemont case. You've analyzed the court-martial that resulted from my intervention. You've examined the protocols that emerged from systematic leadership failure. Now I want to explain what those institutional events actually mean for your careers and your responsibilities as officers." She paused, ensuring that every newly commissioned officer understood the gravity of what she was about to articulate. "Authority without competence is dangerous," Victoria said, her voice steady and clear. "When commanding officers make decisions about personnel safety, equipment readiness, or operational capability, they must have the technical knowledge to understand what they're deciding. If they don't possess that knowledge, they have a responsibility to defer to people who do. Confusing rank with expertise is how toxic command climates develop." She continued, articulating the principles that had guided her military service. "Institutional loyalty means protecting the mission and the personnel who execute that mission, not protecting incompetent leaders. Real loyalty sometimes requires institutional courage, the willingness to challenge authority when that authority is creating harm. That's not insubordination. That's institutional integrity." Victoria addressed the most controversial aspect of her methodology directly. Sometimes, protecting the mission requires methods that make traditional officers uncomfortable. "The covert assessment I conducted at Fort Ridgemont violated several conventional protocols. It was irregular. It was unconventional. But it was necessary because conventional methods had proven ineffective. You'll face situations where doing the right thing requires departing from established procedures. When that happens, ensure that your departure from procedure serves a legitimate institutional purpose. Document everything. Maintain absolute honesty about your methodology. But don't allow institutional tradition to prevent you from preventing catastrophic failure." The address continued for 30 minutes, with Victoria articulating a vision of military leadership fundamentally different from the model that had dominated Harrington's command. A vision where technical expertise was valued, where raising legitimate concerns was protected rather than punished, where the mission took precedence over individual career advancement, where institutional courage was recognized and rewarded rather than marginalized and punished. As she concluded her address, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her from Navy SEAL to Fort Ridgemont mechanic to keynote speaker at the Naval Academy. The transformation of Fort Ridgemont began with a single woman in disguise, documenting the failures of toxic leadership. But the real transformation occurred when the military institution acknowledged that those failures mattered, that victims of toxic leadership deserved institutional justice, and that preventing future failures required systemic change. That acknowledgement didn't come easily. It required courage from institutional leadership willing to hold a senior officer accountable regardless of his rank or seniority. It required commitment from personnel willing to testify against superior officers despite career risks. It required the kind of institutional courage that doesn't make headlines but quietly reshapes military culture toward competence and integrity. Victoria returned to her seat, watching the newly commissioned officers absorb the implications of what she'd described. These officers represented the future of military leadership, officers who'd studied the Fort Ridgemont case, who understood the dangers of toxic leadership, who grasped the fundamental principle that authority derived its legitimacy from competence and institutional integrity rather than rank alone. As the ceremony concluded and the new officers departed to their first assignments, Victoria understood that the real legacy of Fort Ridgemont would be measured not in policy manuals or academic studies, but in the daily decisions of officers who'd internalized the principle that true leadership meant earning authority through competence and using that authority to protect the people who made the mission possible. The transformation was complete. The institutional culture had shifted. The real work of excellence continued. And throughout the military structure, officers now understood that toxic leadership would be identified, documented, and addressed regardless of rank or seniority. Victoria had proven that institutional courage could reshape military culture itself, one facility at a time, one decision at a time, one officer at a time. The question that had opened this entire narrative, "Who's your commander?" had been answered definitively, and the answer had changed the institution forever. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.